CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the program. Our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping leaves Russia after talks with President Vladimir Putin, but there's no direct support for the war in Ukraine. Our other headlines: pension reform will go ahead. French President Macron insists his controversial bill will come into force despite these protests. The world's most indebted property company, Evergrande, plans to restructure brick by brick. We'll be assessing if it can get its house in order. And Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson on whether he deliberately misled Parliament over those lockdown parties in Downing Street. China's president has ended his state visit to Russia with no progress on peace talks for the war in Ukraine. Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, bid each other farewell following 2 days of talks in Moscow. The leaders called for responsible dialogue to resolve the Ukraine conflict. They referred to each other as dear friends, promised economic cooperation, and described their countries' relations as the best they have ever been. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Yung Chung-Shi in Moscow. Yung Chung-Shi, the presidents talked about peace. What exactly did they say?
Well, Jamie, the joint statement on China and Russia's strategic partnership did lay out the two countries' consensus on the issue of Ukraine. Now, both sides say they emphasize the importance of adhering to the principle of the United Nations Charter and respecting international law. Now, Russia has commended China's impartial position on the issue, and both sides condemn any actions that harm other countries' legitimate security interest. Now, Russia has reaffirmed its commitment to peace talks, and China has proposed constructive solutions to the political settlement of the crisis. Now, the two sides stress the importance of respecting the security concerns of all countries and preventing bloc confrontation. Now, they urge responsible dialogue as the best solution and calls for an end to moves that lead to tensions or prolong the fighting. Both sides oppose unilateral sanctions not authorized by the UN Security Council and instead calls for the international community to support constructive efforts to resolve the crisis.
Now, they were also talking about cooperation and trade. What would stronger Russian-China ties look like for the wider international economy? What would it mean?
Well, the meetings were a major milestone for China and Russia's economic ties. The relationship is further solidified by the two joint statements on strategic partnership and economic cooperation. Now, several new developments were included in the two statements, and here are some of them. Now, meetings between leaders usually provide impetus to top-level regulatory upgrades and optimization. Now, both sides have agreed to promote the drafting of a new version of the investment cooperation plan outline, and they have welcomed the launch of new negotiations for investment agreement signed in 2006. Now, these moves are expected to create a more stable, fair, transparent, and predictable business environment for investors from everywhere. Now, other measures will expand the scale of trade. Now, first is developing e-commerce, where Chinese platforms have world-leading expertise. When goods are bought and sold online, logistics becomes the next challenge, and that's why the second measure will see both sides working to ensure convenient transportation by rail, road, air, waterways, and sea. Now, thirdly, China and Russia will increase the use of local currency for trade, investment, and loans. This, experts say, can reduce the reliance on the American dollar for settlements, lower exchange rate risks, and make bilateral trade more efficient. Now, these measures are interlinked together, and they are expected to optimize trade between the two countries. And experts say the economic benefits generated from it will benefit every investors that have projects in these two countries. Yung
Chung-Shi in Moscow, thank you very much for that. Russia's foreign minister says plans to send depleted uranium to the Ukraine will mark a serious escalation in the conflict. Sergei Lavrov was speaking after the UK announced plans to send the armor-piercing rounds to Kyiv, along with its delivery of Challenger 2 tanks. Moscow claims the shells have a nuclear component, but Britain has accused Putin of spreading false information. Earlier, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned that Russia will be forced to respond if the delivery goes ahead. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Stuart Smith, in Moscow. Stuart, what has President Putin been saying about this munitions, this shell delivery?
Well, when talking about this, indeed, he used the phrase a nuclear component. So he seems cognizant of the difference between nuclear weapons and ammunition that has elements that are radioactive. But nonetheless, the Russian president said it would require a response from Russia should the deliveries go ahead. In addition, the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, here suggested that it would be interpreted as bringing the potential risk of a nuclear collision between Russia and the West as getting even closer. The foreign ministry here in Russia, the spokesperson, said that she believed this was potentially hazardous for the environment and for people that could ingest any of the radioactive elements, potentially knocked up by the dust after shelling, which could, only if ingested, cause harm to health, even though the uranium itself is much less radioactive than enriched uranium and also uranium ordinarily found in the earth. The fact it's depleted uranium means much of its radioactivity has lessened, but it is still, to an extent, radioactive.
And what's been the response from the UK's Ministry of Defence?
Well, James Cleverly, the UK Foreign Secretary, has been very pointed in his remarks, trying to make it clear that there is a difference between nuclear weapons and elements of ammunition that have uranium in them or radioactive elements. So he said that Russia is being disingenuous when appearing concerned about this because of that important difference. Now, he does address the claims that there would be potentially harmful health effects from this. His assessment, or the UK assessment, is that the impact to personal health and the environment is likely to be very low. The Ministry of Defence cites independent research studies on that aspect. It's also not known whether Russia is using its own ammunition with a uranium component in the so-called special military operation, but we do know Russia uses that weapon, uses that artillery, and has that ammunition in general. As to what the UK is doing here, it says it's only trying to help Ukraine defend itself. It says there is no threat to Russia, but undoubtedly these shells, if delivered to Ukraine, will be used by the Ukrainian armed forces against the Russian military.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Stuart Smith, in Moscow. 12 people have been killed and hundreds injured in a powerful earthquake that hit large parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The 6.5 magnitude quake caused landslides and sent people running from their homes in freezing temperatures. The earthquake center was in a remote area, difficult for rescue teams to access. Security forces in Lebanon have fired tear gas at hundreds of protesters, mainly retired members of the army, who tried to break through the fence leading to the government headquarters in Beirut. Demonstrators are outraged at the deteriorating value of state pensions paid in the local currency. The Lebanese pound has lost more than 98% of its value against the US dollar since 2019. British ministers have delayed raising the retirement age from 66 to 68 as life expectancy falls in the UK. Some Conservative MPs have expressed concern that an increase may provoke a backlash from middle-aged voters. Raising the state pension age is controversial. The issue has caused riots on the streets of France. The decision in the UK will now be pushed back until next year's election. Well, French President Emmanuel Macron has defended his pension reform plans and insisted that his bill will be enacted before the end of the year. This is the first time Macron has spoken publicly about the changes since his government forced the reform through by bypassing Parliament. His new policy increases the retirement age in France from 62 to 64, and it sparked widespread protests. On Monday, Macron's government survived 2 no-confidence votes. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Ross Cullen in Paris. Ross, President Macron doubling down on pushing through his reforms?
Yeah, Jamie, it was a combative, defensive performance from the president in his appearance earlier today from the Elysee Palace, live, an interview with two TV anchors. He was not shying away from saying that this reform is going to be continuing. It will be continuing on its democratic path through parliaments and different constitutional hurdles to come into force by the end of the year. He says that we had reached a compromise, 7 MPs and 7 senators working together in a mixed commission. It was voted on by the Senate. We had to use 49.3, this special constitutional article, to force it through the lower house after there was no majority. He says that we knew that opened us up to 2 no-confidence votes, which we survived, and we can now proceed with the next stage of the reform, which is when it's going to be examined by constitutional experts who will rule on the constitutionality of the different articles in that legislation. He said he didn't want to do it, Jamie. He said it wasn't pleasurable experience for him. It wasn't a luxury or something he liked. He said it was a necessity, the pension reform. It was something that the country had to face up to after the pandemic and with the ongoing war in Ukraine hitting the country's finances. It is something that needs to happen after decades and decades of public spending, but not maybe as much production, wanting the country to produce more for working longer as well, saying that everyone has to put in a bit more effort to try to help with the increase in this retirement age. We have seen a furious response, though, from the unions already, as we expect major continuing protests on Thursday.
Ross, we've seen protests since this legislation was pushed through Parliament last Thursday. Will Macron's interview, those conciliatory words, go any way to perhaps keeping the protesters off the streets?
The protesters not seeing any conciliatory words in that interview. Philippe Martinez, who's leader of one of the biggest unions here, saying that we have had some of the biggest protests in France in 30 years, since the start of the year, week after week, of hundreds of thousands of people each week in Paris, millions nationwide, taking to the streets to show their opposition to this reform. Philippe Martinez, in an immediate reaction to the president's interview, saying there was no recognition by Emmanuel Macron of this. There was no response to the pressure on the streets, these amazing numbers that we are seeing week after week. He said there was no recognition of the content of the messages and the slogans and the demands from the streets. Emmanuel Macron, for his part, did say that he recognises people's right to protest. He said that there is going to be another demonstration tomorrow, Thursday. I respect that. People who are demonstrating are opposed to these reforms. I respect their opposition as well. He said he wanted to see some more suggestions from the unions, who say, we have been writing to Elizabeth Bourne, the Prime Minister. We have been writing to the government for weeks now with our suggestions for how to change these reforms. So at the moment, when it comes to intransigence on both sides, Jamie, the continuing determination from the unions to show their opposition to this with protests in the street, and the continuing determination from the president to pursue these reforms.
Ross, thanks for that. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Boris, those lockdown parties, and some difficult questions. The UK's former Prime Minister on whether he deliberately misled Parliament.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. China's President Xi Jinping leaves Russia after talks with President Vladimir Putin, but there's still no direct support for the war in Ukraine. Our other headlines: pension reform will go ahead. French President Macron insists his controversial bill will come into force despite these protests. The world's most indebted property developer, Evergrande, is set to unveil a restructuring plan for its offshore debt. It follows the company acquiring support from its overseas creditors. Evergrande, once China's top-selling developer, has offshore debts of almost $23 billion as part of liabilities totaling $300 billion. Well, founded in the late 1990s in the Chinese city of Guangzhou, Evergrande's founder, Xu Jiayin, adopted an aggressive growth strategy that catapulted the company to the top of the national real estate industry. The firm says it grew to have 200,000 employees, but indirectly created more than 3.8 million jobs every year. Evergrande shares and bonds were included in indexes and funds all across Asia. Well, besides building homes, of course, the conglomerate also ventured into other industries, including electric vehicles, life insurance, sport, and even a theme park. After expanding rapidly for years and snapping up assets as China's economy boomed, Evergrande became snowed under a debt of $300 billion. In 2020, Chinese regulators set new limits on property developers' debt levels, and Evergrande was the world's most indebted property group. Well, the company sold off assets and delayed bond repayments in a bid to try and stay afloat. In August 2021, many Evergrande projects across the country halted construction due to overdue payments. Then around a year later, bondholders refused to accept any more delays. As questions grew over their handling of company finances, the CEO and CFO stepped down and Evergrande's Hong Kong headquarters were put up for sale. Well, let's talk now to Hong Hao, the chief economist at Grow Investment Group. Welcome to the programme. We were expecting to see the restructuring plan as early as today, but so far, I'm not sure about you, we haven't seen any sign, any clue what's going on. Is there a delay?
Yeah, well, we're probably not surprised by another delay. After all, they have delayed the audited result release, right? So after changing the auditor, right? So everything seems, with this company seems to be not quite on schedule. And also, we're talking about restructuring $22.7 billion worth of debt, and the total debt amount to, more than $300 billion. Right? So, any deal of this size would involve a very complex negotiation with different parties. There are some, details, some rumors about how they're going to extend the maturity, and also, so that they can lower the coupon rate. But with so complex, such a deal, so complex, it needs so many different parties to agree upon. That's why I think it's taking some time.
What do you think are the next steps for Evergrande? I mean, what happens next, do you think?
Well, I think, more likely than not, yeah, they're going to extend the maturity so that they can lower the coupon rate they have to pay. So that, for 2022, the contracted sales for Evergrande actually, plunged more than 40%. All right, so according to some public information, even though, the audited result is late to file, but we can already see some very distressed financial numbers that are showing up. So they have to cut down the debt, and they also have to clean up the inventory. They probably have to do some asset disposal so that they can recover some money to pay off some of the liabilities that is already past due, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very, very complex situation. But I think, the person who administered the Hainan Air, which is another heavily indebted company before Evergrande. So she has plenty of experience administering very complex deals, and hopefully, she can work wonder again here.
Very briefly, are you an optimist? What do you think the broader outlook is for the Chinese property market?
For the month of February, we're seeing pickup in sales, especially with the SOE firms, right? So SOE firms, February sales is up 44%. But I think private firms sales is down 33%, right? So overall, it's a very mixed picture. We need more data to confirm that the recovery is in place, and hopefully going into the second half of this year, we see healthier numbers.
Hong Hao, thanks so much for that. I hope we can get you back on the programme when we finally get to see this report. But for today, thanks for your time and your expertise. Hong Hao, Chief Economist at Grow Investment Group. Now, Britain's former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is right now making a highly anticipated appearance to answer some difficult questions from MPs investigating whether he deliberately misled Parliament over Downing Street parties during lockdown. The hearing is seen as pretty crucial for his political future. We're just going to dip into this live coverage from Westminster. So you're watching the live session of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson answering questions from MPs.
We believed was illicit or unauthorised. Why would we have it on Zoom when you never quite know who is on the other side? Most important of all, if it was obvious to me that these events were contrary to the guidance and the rules, then it must have been equally obvious to dozens of others, including the most senior officials in the country, all of them, like me, responsible for drawing up the rules. And it must have been obvious to others in the building, including the current Prime Minister.
Order, order. We will now suspend the sitting whilst the House of Commons votes, and we will reconvene in 15 minutes.
Thank you.
I think if ever there was a phrase, saved by the bell, it's for this very moment. And there we leave the live coverage from the Houses of Parliament in Westminster and Boris Johnson answering MPs' questions. Our correspondent Michael Voss has been following the story. Well, it's only just started, but it's pretty critical stuff for Boris Johnson's future career, isn't it?
Yes, it really is, because this isn't about whether he misled Parliament. He's admitted that. He told Parliament that all of these parties at Westminster during COVID lockdown were within the legal framework. But then came the police investigation. Boris Johnson and many others were fined for this. So he went back to Parliament and said, I made a mistake. I was told by all my trusted advisors that it was legal. I now know it isn't, and I apologise. So the question that's being asked now at this committee meeting is, did he deliberately mislead Parliament or not? It kicked off about 20 minutes ago. The opening statement came from the chair of this Privileges Committee, Harriet Harman. She said, democracy depends on trust. And what they're going to look at is what was the information at the time about COVID rules? What did Boris Johnson and his advisors know about that? And what did he tell Parliament? We've just seen Boris Johnson giving his version of these events, saying quite clearly, he says he did not lie about this and everything he said was in good faith. We won't know today the outcome of this, but it could affect his political future. If he deliberately lied to Parliament, he could be suspended from Parliament. There could even be a by-election where he'd have to stand for his seat and potentially lose it again. It could be the end of his political career. If they find that actually he didn't mislead, he genuinely believed in good faith, then actually his political career is back on track.
Now, as you say, we're not going to know the outcome of Boris Johnson's fate for a good few hours. The bell that we heard when we were listening to the live feed was, I think, the division bell, because while this Boris Johnson story is going on, also in the House of Commons, I think that MPs are about to vote, a crucial vote, actually, on the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. So they're all running out of that committee room because they're going to go and vote. Tell us about that.
OK, so this is a vote on what's called the Windsor Framework, where Rishi Sunak reached an agreement with the European Union to change and improve the trade relationships between Northern Ireland and Britain, because they have this border with the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU and which must stay open. It was hailed by the Prime Minister as a major victory. It's now being put to the vote in Parliament. Boris Johnson has said he'll vote against it. Some on the right wing of the party, the European Research Group, say they'll vote against it. The question now is how many Tory Conservative MPs will vote against the Prime Minister's new Northern Ireland treaty, and the size of that vote, or the size of the vote against it, will give an idea, one, of how much support Boris Johnson still has in Parliament, or actually just how thin the majority is for Rishi Sunak.
Michael, thank you for that. Our correspondent Michael Voss. UK inflation jumped unexpectedly last month to 10.4% following 3 consecutive months of slowing. Salad and vegetable shortages helped push up food prices at the fastest rate in 45 years. Alcohol prices in restaurants and pubs also drove up costs for households. The increase adds some pressure on the Bank of England to increase interest rates again this week. The world is blindly travelling down a dangerous path of vampiric overconsumption of water. That's the blunt warning from the United Nations. Their new report has warned of a looming global water crisis with a risk of shortages due to overdevelopment and climate change. This all comes as thousands of delegates gather in New York for the first major United Nations Water Summit since 1977. Now, known as the kidney of North China, the Bayangdian wetlands were under threat from pollution, but a plan launched 6 years ago aimed to try and reverse that. Our correspondent Ning Hong went along to see the results.
Once the largest freshwater lake and wetland in North China, years of pollution and drought had nearly dried up Bayangdian. Now, after 6 years of treatment, Bayangdian has regained its picturesque scenery.
Our goal is to protect and restore the environment of Bayangdian, mainly through 3 aspects: controlling the water quality entering Bayangdian, reducing pollution sources in the water, and ecological water replenishment, introducing more and better quality water sources.
The Xiong'anyu area was established in 2017, and protection of the ecological environment was a key factor in urban planning. In recent years, the local Ecological Environment Bureau, together with departments such as water conservation and agriculture, has taken a series of actions to restore the water quality, environment, and ecology of Bayangdian.
The ecological environment and water quality of Bayangdian have undergone a fundamental change, and the water quality has been upgraded from the level 5 to level 3. According to our observation records, the number of wild bird species has reached 252, an increase of 46 species compared to before the establishment of the Xiong'anyu area. The number of fish species has also increased to 46, an increase of 19 species compared to before.
In the north of Bayangdian, a new city is under construction. It's designed to be a green, ecological, and livable city. The water area of Bayangdian expanding with an average depth of 6 to 7 meters, and nearby groundwater has also significantly improved. Ning Hong, CGTN, Hebei Province.
And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. Keep up with all the news. Head over to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or snap the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.